This is part 2 of our conversation with Stephen Studdert. Studdert worked for 3 U.S. presidents and was the man in charge of the 1989 inaugural of President George Bush. You can find earlier episodes on our blog at 249.com.
A couple of interesting things as we think toward this inauguration coming up. Most of them are, you may agree or disagree with this, but most of them are relatively predictable from the common viewer standpoint. There's going to be a parade, and the president's going to speak and make some remarks. Can we predict what this one's going to be like? Is it going to be relatively the same, or are we going to see something vastly different?
Well, remember, there's 3 inaugural committees at work. Mm-hmm. One is the Trump-Pence inaugural committee, appointed by the president-elect and the vice president-elect. Mm-hmm. The second one is the military inaugural committee, which is nothing to do with the Trump-Pence organization. It's run by the military because they are inaugurating a new commander-in-chief. Mm-hmm. And the tradition for that goes clear back to George Washington. And the third one is the Congressional Inaugural Committee, which again is independent of the first two, because the oath of office occurs on their home site. It occurs at the Capitol building. And they're responsible for those pieces. So there are a lot of predictable elements that will occur, and they're consistent from inaugural to inaugural.
We've heard, at least for this upcoming one, that there could be some protests, and I'm sure that that's something that happens to some degree with just about any president who's being inaugurated. How did you plan for that, presuming there was some thought of some type of protest during any of that?
I'll just tell you a little bit of an aside. We were in New York once with President Reagan, and he went up to his suite in the hotel. And he turned on the television, was watching the local news, and they were showing this coverage of mass demonstrations at Reagan's hotel. Mm-hmm. And on television, it looked mass. Yeah. And he looked out the window of his suite, and I remember that he looked down at the sidewalk, and there's a demonstration. And it's about 200 people wide and 2 people deep. Yeah. It's not a massive demonstration at all. And he just turned to us and said, I am so disappointed that I can't draw a bigger demonstration. So there's an element of humor associated with it. You expect these things. Mm-hmm. I remember my mother called me once when I was working in the White House, and she's watching the news, and she said, are you safe? And I said, what are you talking about? She said, well, the White House is under attack. Well, we're inside the White House. I wasn't even aware that there was some massive demonstration going on out on the streets. Yeah. So you keep it in perspective. It's something you deal with every single presidential event. And for inaugurals, there's extensive planning done, not only by the Secret Service, who has principal responsibility for major national events like that, but all of the law enforcement agencies that are involved, and there are many. They all have intelligence units, and they're very sensitive and attentive to the right of free speech. That's one of the great things about America, is that we have a right to boo if we want to, but we don't have a right to cause disruption that hurts people. And so there's a very, very sensitive balance between accommodating demonstrators and protesters and restricting them to certain areas. Now, there's some sense in this inaugural that there's going to be more demonstration than there is in the past. It's a new phenomenon. In the past, the losers have been good losers. And this time it appears the losers are bad losers. In the past, at least in my lifetime, the party that lost sets aside the animosity for the inauguration and joins in celebrating that this is a great thing in America, this wonderful transfer of power. This time, there's a lot of sense that there'll be some substantial demonstrations the day after inaugural. There's supposedly a very large anti-Trump demonstration scheduled.
That's the messaging of the protesters. The president-elect himself has had, I think, more than he's probably given credit for, a broad spectrum of message tone. There have been times when, particularly on Twitter, that he'll attack someone. But I think the night of the election, after Secretary Clinton had called to concede, that was a different tone of speech, and one for which he received high praise.
His remarks were gracious, magnanimous, and really nonpartisan, non-political.
Do you think we'll see a speech more like that?
I think so. Inaugural addresses are presidential history. They're not a stump speech. They are a speech for the whole world. And let me tell you, the world watches very, very carefully. Ambassadors, all of them are invited as special guests, all those who have foreign ambassador posts in the United States, and all of them watch and listen very carefully. Inaugural speeches are crafted very carefully, and the presidents that I've known have written the first draft or the major outline of the speech themselves. The things that they want to say from their heart to America and to the world.
What is the role of the First Lady in all of this? The incoming First Lady or the outgoing First Lady? What role do they play in making any decisions about what will happen as part of the inaugural or with the White House itself?
You know, it's an interesting thing, the role of the First Lady generally. The President of the United States is an employee of the United States government, works for the people. The First Lady, there is no such formal office, and yet the First Lady has taxpayer-provided staff, taxpayer-provided offices, and her duties are really whatever she wants them to be, and it varies from First Lady to First Lady. The one thing, however, with respect to inaugurals, and the ones where I was involved, we sat down with the President-elect and the First Lady-to-be and said, what do you want this inaugural to be? What do you want it to say? And in my experience with First Ladies, they had some very clear things that were important to them. Who was highlighted? Who was honored? Who was included? What's the tone and tenor and texture of our message? Those kinds of things were very important.
The Mormon Tabernacle Choir has been a little bit in the news because they have accepted an invitation to go and perform at the inaugural. If I'm not mistaken, they did this at least once.
No, I think I can name several times they've done it.
Yeah, they did it. Of the three you did, were they were part of at least one?
They did. They were the first Reagan, I recall, and the Bush Senior.
Okay.
But for example, they did Richard Nixon. They did Lyndon Johnson. It's not a partisan thing. If someone, an entity, or an individual is invited by the inaugural committee to perform at the inaugural, it's not partisan. There's no asking, are you Republican, are you Democrat? Did you vote for this candidate? Did you vote for somebody else? There's none of that. This is America celebrating the office of the presidency and the free democratic exchange of power. And the Tabernacle Choir, when invited in the past, has accepted, and this time they were invited and they accepted. They're not there to celebrate Donald Trump per se. They're celebrating the office of the American presidency and democracy and freedom.
What's your biggest concern in that final week? What are the things you're sorting through?
At that point, you're beginning to look for what have we missed? Where are the holes? For example, we were doing a planning meeting, and I noticed that there were 600 VIP buses that had to go from one side of Pennsylvania Avenue to another side of Pennsylvania Avenue. But it wasn't in the police plan that anybody could go across. Well, what are you going to do with 600 busloads of VIPs, most of whom were diplomats, if we hadn't caught that kind of a mistake? So you're fine-tuning all of the details. You're also dealing with enormous numbers of people in America whose invitation didn't get to them, or they got the wrong tickets, or they talked to their senator who said, well, you're going to sing the national anthem at the inaugural. Those kind of things.
Yeah, a lot of details to iron out.
Enormous. We, for example, on the invitation side, you can't send out invitations until you develop a guest list. And when we sent out invitations, we did about 15,000 FedEx packages per day. So you get some idea of the magnitude of this.
Is there a playbook for this? Like when you, it would seem like if it's something we're going to do every 4 years and a certain percentage of it has to be the same this time as it was last time, you know which roads you're going to go on. And why is there a playbook? And if not, why not? And
well,
should someone write one?
There's sort of a playbook. And one of the very first things I did was invite several of my predecessors to sit down with me immediately and tell me all of the minefields, all of the things that went wrong in theirs that could have been prevented, etc., and to guide us. The second part of it is that the military inaugural committee, they've got the playbook. It's written very clearly. I'll give you an example of how definitive that playbook is. The military units escort the president down Pennsylvania Avenue from the Capitol to the White House. That goes back to George Washington's time. And military units marched in front of him to escort him, okay? And so today, a unit from each of the services, Army, Marines, Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, march in front of the president's limousine. And then a number of units, of course, march behind. The units in front of the president's limo march at 120 steps per minute. The units behind his limo march at 110 steps per minute. So that by the time the limo gets down to the president's new residence at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, there's a 10-minute gap in the parade. This allows the president to go around, be welcomed by the White House domestic staff, the butlers, the cooks, etc., into his new residence, use the restroom, and get to their viewing stand by the time the next units get there. So there's a playbook for that kind of detail.
There's a playbook, and it sounds like the playbook is what builds in the bathroom breaks.
That's correct. And you have to build that in.
Absolutely. What other details of just planning it out would surprise people who have watched this on television or who are going to watch it on television as it happens this week?
Oh, wow, that's
one I've heard about that just to maybe spark your line of thought here. There are a lot of horses involved.
There are a lot of horses.
Horses either leave residue or occasionally you have to probably be prepared in case a horse were to call it quits.
If a horse dies, for example, in the inaugural parade, what's your plan to remediate this problem? Or you have a runaway horse in the inaugural parade, what's your plan? Are you going to have a local DC police officer shoot it with live national worldwide television and
kids,
hundreds of thousands of people right there and children running around? Yeah. So if you talk about horses, where do you lodge the horses? We contracted for stables. We contracted for places to park horse trailers. We contracted for places for the keepers of the horses to sleep and lodge, and we contracted for manure removal. Mm-hmm. And it's a huge issue. Then the issue is whose horses get to be there, and can they come across state lines? And is the USDA certifying the feed that they're using? It's a very complex thing just for the horses.
This conversation with Stephen Studdert has also been brought to you by the Salt Lake Chamber. The Chamber's hosting the Utah Economic Review January 18th at 7:30 in the morning. You can find more information and register on their website at slchamber.com. Coming up on our next episode.
It's a very long day, and the presidents that I've been close to, they didn't sleep well the night before. I don't know that anyone can truly get a sense of the magnitude of what's happening to the degree that they get that sense. They are, at noon today, going to become the most powerful person in the world.